12 days of violence across East Jerusalem, Israel and the West Bank. Israeli officials blame what they call lone wolf Palestinians for random stabbing attacks. But many question Israel's response. Does it have a policy of indiscriminate shooting? This is Inside Story. Hello there, welcome to the programme. I'm Shuli Ghosh. A wave of violence has spread across the occupied Palestinian territories and Israel, raising fears of an uprising. Over the past 2 weeks, at least 4 Israelis and 23 Palestinians have been killed. Hundreds more have been injured. Israeli security forces have struggled to deal with a number of random stabbings by Palestinians. But human rights groups have accused them of using excessive force and carrying out unlawful killings. We'll get to our guests in just a moment, but first, Mike Hanna sets up our discussion from West Jerusalem.
It's the first full cabinet meeting in nearly 3 weeks, and in the intervening time there's been an upsurge in violence in occupied territory and in Israel itself. 4 Israelis have been killed in sporadic and random knife attacks. In most cases, the alleged Palestinian attackers were shot dead on the scene. And a number of Palestinian demonstrators have been killed by Israeli forces in the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The rising fatality figures are raising questions by human rights organizations about the rules of engagement being applied by the Israeli army and police. This is footage of 19-year-old Fadi Alun attempting to flee after stabbing a young Israeli in occupied East Jerusalem. The Israeli civilians are shouting, "Shoot him, kill him." And the police open fire, though there's no apparent immediate threat. A similar situation involving a 30-year-old Palestinian Arab woman in the Galilee. Police are shouting at Isra Abed, "Drop the knife, drop the knife." And once again, instead of attempting an arrest, they open fire at point-blank range. Yet in the south, an Israeli who attacks 4 Palestinians in different locations is not gunned down, but arrested. Israeli police say responses are determined by the specifics of each incident, and adds officers are facing life-threatening situations, and say there are no investigations into any of the police shootings.
The major threat at the moment is the lone wolf Palestinian, either female or male, that can come inside Jerusalem or the Old City and try and continue the pattern. That's what we're dealing with, and that's what we're coming down on as hard as possible.
The Israeli occupying army is subject to military regulations, not civil ones. In the past week, the Palestinian Red Crescent says nearly 300 Palestinians have been shot with live bullets. One of them was 13-year-old Abdul Rahman Abdallah. And in a preliminary investigation, the Israeli army says he was mistakenly killed by sniper fire. His mother says the boy was on his way home from school and there were no demonstrations in the vicinity.
My son went to school like all the other kids, and then he finished school, but he never came back home. They shot him and there were no clashes underway inside the camp.
The Israeli army and the Red Crescent confirm the boy was killed by a .22 bullet fired from a Ruger sniper rifle. A weapon the Israeli military says is non-lethal, yet one that has been responsible for at least 5 Palestinian deaths this year, according to the B'Tselem Human Rights Organization.
The United Nations specifies fundamental principles in terms of firearms use by law enforcement officials. These provide that live fire may only be used when there's an imminent threat of death or serious injury. In other circumstances, the killings may be regarded as extrajudicial. In addition, as an occupying force, the Israeli army should also be subject to several restrictions in terms of international law.
And several human rights organizations are arguing that full, transparent investigation into all the killings and shootings must be held. Otherwise, the Israeli government itself could be complicit in deaths that have no legal justification in international or indeed Israeli law. Mike Hanna, Al Jazeera, West Jerusalem.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. In Tel Aviv, Gideon Levy, columnist for Haaretz newspaper and author of The Punishment of Gaza. In Ramallah, Sari Bashi, Israel-Palestine Country Director for Human Rights Watch. And in Amman, Muin Rabbani, Senior Fellow with the Institute for Palestine Studies. Welcome to all of you to the programme. Gideon, let me start with you because it's clear the Israeli government is extremely worried by the unrest and violence that it's been seeing. It's brought in several measures. One of them, it seems, is to give police greater latitude in opening fire in the face of threats. I mean, that seems to be happening more often.
Yeah, absolutely. They took exactly the opposite measures that they should have taken. And those measures that they take now are far too late, because one shouldn't start yesterday or today. One should start a few months ago and see how this inevitable uprising came to our lives. It was a very, very clear sequence of events, one after the other, which all led to almost an inevitable uprising. I mean, nobody can claim that the written was not on the wall, that the warning was not on the wall. The warning was very clear on the wall, and now nobody knows how to get out of it.
And in fact, it's not just the police and the security forces. The same latitude seems to be extending to Israeli citizens. The Defence Minister, Moshe Yaalon, urging civilians to carry guns so they can, quote, shoot terrorists.
Yeah, I mean, those populistic declarations can just lead to more bloodshed. Because in the recent week, as your reporter very well had reported, there were at least half of the casualties were casualties which were executed, which could have been, almost all of them, could have been arrested very easily. And the proof is that when Jewish terrorists did very similar things, it was very easy to arrest them, to bring them to justice. But here the happy trigger policy is getting a very clear demonstration. And you know, it's a bitter irony, because one of the reasons to this uprising, which is the ongoing dehumanization of the Palestinians, gets now such a clear demonstration when Palestinians are shot dead many times without any reasonable reason.
Sari, Human Rights Watch has a very personal connection to this. A Human Rights Watch research assistant was shot and wounded by Israeli forces at a demonstration. Was she posing any threat? Have you been given any reason for this? What happened?
No, and I think what happened to Human Rights Watch's research assistant is indicative of what's happening all over the West Bank and sadly Gaza too. Our research assistant was shot last week at a demonstration that was peaceful. There was no apparent threat to the Israeli forces. She certainly herself played no threat and was actually identifiable wearing a flak jacket marked press, so it should have been clear that she was not to be targeted and actually was to be protected. She was hit twice with rubber bullets and apparently grazed by a live bullet, and 7 other people were also wounded at that demonstration. But the problem is not just our research assistant. The problem is that all over the West Bank and also inside Israel and in Gaza, police are following a very problematic message from the highest levels of the Israeli leadership. The Israeli leadership is sending a dangerously mistaken interpretation of the obligations that soldiers and police have toward Palestinians living in the occupied territory and also inside Israel. You noted the UN guiding principles on the use of force. Police and soldiers are to use firearms only when absolutely necessary, and lethal force can only be used when strictly necessary to protect life. That is not the pattern we are seeing, not in demonstrations and not in the apprehension of suspects.
Israeli soldiers, of course, would say, Sari, that they do believe their lives are in danger, and that is exactly why they are taking this action. And we have seen Israeli deaths.
For years, human rights organizations have asked to see the rules of engagement that these soldiers are operating under, and for years that request has been denied. We want that transparency because our concern is that Israeli soldiers are not being instructed according to the relevant provisions of international law and also according to the provisions of the law of occupation, which is another branch of international law that requires Israel to protect the Palestinians living in the occupied territory and take whatever measures necessary to try to ensure the health and safety of civilians.
Okay.
Instead, the messages we hear are, for example, something that the police minister said last year when a suspected assailant was shot to death after stabbing an Israeli in Jerusalem. He said a terrorist who attacks somebody should be killed. That is not the message a police minister should send. The message is that an attacker should be arrested.
Muin, Gideon making the point there that, look, the writing was on the wall. The dehumanising conditions that Palestinians live in meant that, he calls it an uprising. Other people are saying this is the start of perhaps a third intifada, but this has been coming.
Yes, I think that's entirely correct. And part of the reason, excuse me, Sari Bashi was speaking about Israel having a mistaken interpretation of its obligations under international law and the law of occupation. I'd go a little further and say Israel believes it has no obligation whatsoever under either international law or the law of occupation. And where there is a clash between its conduct and the law, the Israeli position is it's the law's fault and the law needs to be rewritten. So, you talked about lone wolves. I think a more serious problem here is the collective hyena that is the Israeli military and its settler army in the occupied territories. And precisely as Gideon Levy has stated, there's been an entire series of actions and provocations and attempts to change the status quo and so on that have inevitably led us to where we are today.
Let me ask you, Gideon, what does the Israeli government say when people quote international law at them? For example, as Sari rightly points out, according to the 4th Geneva Convention, people accused of offences should be charged and tried, not shot dead. What does Israel say when people accuse them of violating international law?
According to the Israeli set of values, international law should be applied everywhere in the world except of one place, and this is Israel. Israel is a different case, they will say. Part of the members of the current government will tell you that there is no occupation in the West Bank and therefore there is no question of international law because nobody occupied the West Bank. The West Bank should be Jewish, will be Jewish, was Jewish, and will forever remain Jewish. And therefore, there is no question of international law. And above all, they will tell you that the soldiers are always in life danger. The soldiers are obviously always the victims, the only occupation in history which always victimizes himself. We are the victims and the Palestinians are the aggressors. And there, what relevance does international law have?
OK, well, let's listen to what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been saying about all this violence. He says that Palestinians are instigating it by spreading misinformation about the status of Aqsa Mosque compound, of course, a sensitive subject for both Jews and Muslims.
We're in the midst of a terror wave whose roots are in the deceitful and systematic incitement regarding Temple Mount. The incitement comes from Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, and the Islamic movement in Israel. During the weekend, I instructed the recruitment of 16 units of border police reservists to restore security and order. It's better to recruit a massive force in advance to face possible developments than to recruit it once attacks have taken place. And we will recruit more, as many as the situation requires.
Muin, so Netanyahu saying that this is misinformation, that this is to do with concerns, unfounded concerns over the status of Aqsa Mosque compound. Is it just to do with that, or is it about the long history of occupation, the fact that Palestinians, deal with checkpoints, they deal with arrests, with property demolitions? Is it the whole system of occupation which has got to this point?
Well, it's both. And what Netanyahu is basically saying is you should believe what he says and not what you see with your own eyes when the Israeli military and police are now routinely deployed to the Haram al-Sharif to regularize the capacity of Jewish settlers to basically convert part of it for exclusive Jewish religious rights. And there's, I think, a very justified fear that what the Netanyahu government is seeking to do is to put the same arrangements in place in the Haram al-Sharif that they have done in the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron, where they used a settler massacre of Palestinians, not to punish the settlers, but to divide that mosque in half and reserve half of it for exclusively Jewish worship. And there's a very justified fear that we are seeing the beginnings of something similar in Jerusalem. And I mean, you know, even the Jordanian government, which is by no means an enemy of Israel, has been making very serious noises about this and basically reading the Riot Act to Israel on this count. But yes, you're right. I mean, it's not one single incident or one single policy. It's half a century of occupation, of annexation, of brutalization, of violence, of colonization, and this is all coming together once again, as it has on so many other occasions, where at a certain point, for reasons that are not always entirely clear, Palestinians began spontaneously taking to the streets and basically expressing their total rejection and disgust of the continuation of the status quo.
Sari, do you agree with that? And where do you think this could lead?
I mean, I'm concerned that the Israeli government is taking its responsibilities in the opposite direction. So the occupation, as everyone is accurately noting, is entering its 50th year soon. And the longer an occupation goes on, the more that the occupier, which is exercising sovereignty in the Palestinian territory, the more it has an obligation to protect the human rights of people living in that territory. Because it is the government. It is performing the governmental functions. And instead of being more protective of human rights as time has gone on, Israel has become less protective, and it is characterizing protesters and civilians as dangers and using terms of war as if we are going to war with the civilians that we need to be protecting in the occupied territory. And that is a very problematic framework because it's not going to calm things down. It's only going to escalate because the more people are getting harmed and killed in these demonstrations, the more difficult it's going to be to bring things back to a state of quiet.
OK, let's take a look at this. This is a video that was released earlier this month, which is also causing a lot of concern. It appears to show an Israeli undercover unit in action. The armed officers had infiltrated a group of young Palestinians throwing stones at Israeli forces in Ramallah. They actually join in with the stone throwing and then they turn on the group and pull out their weapons, shooting and wounding 3 Palestinians. A witness from Reuters says he heard the Israeli undercover agents inciting the youths to throw stones before drawing out their guns, and eventually the undercover agents are joined by Israeli security forces. Gideon, when you get a situation where an undercover unit is actually inciting Palestinians to throw stones, and the whole idea, to those of us outside Israel, of stone-throwing youths being shot to death as a retribution for that. I mean, how does that come anywhere close to complying with international law?
You see, the more the occupation is brutal, the more the resistance becomes violent. And this is a vicious circle, and nobody can stop the vicious circle, not by any kind of units, not by any kind of weapons. The solution is far, far away from where it's being looked for by the Israeli government. More units, more troops, more covered and undercovered, and more weapons and more intelligence and more fighting and bloodshed. The solution is exactly in the opposite direction, and this government will never turn to the opposite direction. And therefore, incidents like you have shown just now will continue to take place and will become worse and worse. The video you just showed now is almost a routine in the West Bank.
There seems to be a situation being created where the violence is going to spiral. Just last month, the Palestinian public opinion poll revealed that 57% of Palestinians support a return to armed intifada. I mean, many Palestinians feel that that is the only choice.
What can you tell them? Can you tell them? There were now almost 10 years of relative silence, relatively peaceful years, almost 10 years. What achievement did the Palestinian people gain in those years? What kind of offers did Israel make to maintain this peaceful or relatively peaceful years?
I can see that Muin wants to add to that.
Corner, the only way...
Yes, well, I just wanted to return to what Sari Bashi was saying earlier about Israel's obligations under international law. She's, of course, completely right, but perhaps the more pertinent observation is Gideon Levy's, that it's simply inconceivable that Israel, and particularly this Israeli government, is going to respect those obligations. And so I think the real issue here is the role of the international community, and particularly the West, which basically looks the other way when Israel carries out all these outrages, and then when Palestinians begin resisting them, calls upon the Palestinian Authority to fulfill its obligations under this Oslo agreement and do all it can to ensure the security of the occupation. So I think there's a fundamental problem here, which is the approach, particularly of the West, towards this conflict, towards this occupation, and now for 20 years, allowing a terrible situation to go to catastrophic, and maintaining this illusion, that if only Israel is allowed to continue unchallenged, and if only the Palestinians are encouraged even more to restrain their own people, that somehow things will improve.
Okay, Sari, how do you think the world would react if the violence spirals? I mean, many young Palestinians are post-Oslo, the post-Oslo generation. They were born after Oslo was signed. Many of them feel that Oslo has brought them nothing, and that the only way to get some kind of two-state solution is to have an uprising.
Look, I think there's a lot of underlying problems even before this round of violence began. In the West Bank, certainly in Gaza, there's tremendous numbers of unemployment. There's access restrictions that prevent the Palestinian economy from flourishing. In Gaza, it's almost impossible to travel. 80% of young women in Gaza are unemployed. It's a very, very difficult situation. Add to that, if we're looking at young people, some more lax open fire regulations that Israel is trying to approve to authorize police in Jerusalem and inside Israel to fire live shots at stone throwers, many of whom are children. And I think there is something that can be done right now by those in the international community who want to stop the situation from getting worse. And what can be done is to ask Israel not to approve these additional measures that would authorize even more destructive and dangerous use of force against stone throwers, many of whom are children.
Okay, but
and also to take measures to protect demonstrators.
Last word to Gideon, though. Do you think that is likely to happen, Gideon? How do you see this playing out?
No, by all means not. And I want to refer to my friend Moen Srabani's remarks about the involvement of the international community. I think Israel gains today more freedom to go wild more than ever before. I mean, the American administration lost interest, total interest in what's going on here. The EU is just a pale shadow of the American administration. And Israel has now a carte blanche to go wild. I don't see anyone stopping Israel right now. And this is very, very worrying, because I totally agree with Moen's attitude. The only actor who can do something in this situation is the international actor, and mainly the West, and mainly the United States. They don't seem to have any interest in it.
It's a really interesting discussion, and there are obviously lots of issues still to talk about, but we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed to all my guests, Gideon Levy, Sari Bashi and Muin Rabbani. And thanks to you at home for watching. As always, you can leave your comments on the programmes page of our website, aljazeera.com. You can post your views on facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or you can tweet us at AJ Inside Story. Thanks for watching from me and all the team here. Bye for now.